Welcome to the Xeno Podcast, where we look at how we shape stories and how they shape us. Today we have Professor Aaron Densley with us, and Jackson's going to do the intro for that.
Professor Densley is an acting professor and a theater professor. He also does the theater workshop class, which is basically the set building class, and I'm in that class. It's a grand old time. He went to school in Penn State for his master's, and I saw an article on the internet about something about a medical play, and there was an end-of-life decisions play. Could you just elaborate on that?
Absolutely. So it was this devised work that is called Drifting, and it's a play about one of my professors, Dr. William Doan. He had a tragedy in his family, and he writes a lot of independent work, and so he'll do one-man shows and things like that. And so he had this play, and he wanted us to be a part of it. And his sister had traumatic brain injury, and so he often sat there, being a theater person, wondering like what was going on inside of her brain. Like, was she there? Because there were times that he felt like, she was there, and then he felt like she wasn't there, and he felt like he would go back and replay all of these memories from their past together, and so it was just a really emotional time for him because she had been in a terrible accident and was in a nursing home, and the doctors were like, well, this is her existence now. She's not going to come out of this coma, and she's just going to stay like this, forever. And so it was really hard for Dr. Doan to see that and have to deal with that, because all of his family was like staunch Catholic. We can't terminate her life. We can't do that. And he was really struggling because he knew her and was like, she would not want this. And is she even there? Like, in all of these questions. And so we were trying to figure out, so that was the premise of the story. But then we started getting some of the neuroscientists involved at Penn State in the play. And my movement professor, who was directing it, Andy Belser, he, all of his movement work is about, connecting neuroscience to performance, right? Because our bodies, it's just, when you're an actor, you're talking about sensitivity, and sensation, right? That you're trying to get this emotional reaction out of yourself, or energetic reaction out of yourself, and all of that is neuroscience, right? It's just neuroscience that we don't have the technology for yet. And so as we were doing this, we were collaborating together. That they'd bring in these words. Me and Megan Pickerel and Jake Wentlant were the three that I played Dr. Doan's character, and Megan, my friend, was playing the sister, which we called it the body and the bed, right? And so we had this little doll, and the doll was representing the body, and then it would meld back and forth. And so it was just this really interesting thing. And as we worked it, we were getting ready for this performance in New York at a space that's almost like its intention is to help people with their devised works, to have like a space to perform them in New York. And it's kind of one of the forefront devised theater spaces. And so it's called Dixon Place. And so we went there with it. And then after Dixon Place, we got some interest from the Hershey Medical School in Hershey, Pennsylvania. And so we went and we performed it there. And it was just really, really well received, because the doctors were talking to us and saying, we have so much time spent on the science of it that we never really get to have any real understanding of what it's like for the family, right? That we can, our bedside manner and all that stuff, we learn about that. But as far as the real struggle of what someone is going through, that this was one of the first times that they had somebody organize their experience with the end of life of someone that they loved and really articulate what it is that they're going through. And so it was really great for them to see and have conversations about, okay, how do we behave in these situations, right? Like, how do we help families deal with this when maybe there's one family member that is holding on to some kind of false hope, and how do we be more clear but sensitive? It's like, it's just an impossible situation to try to figure out. And so since I've been a part of that project, we graduated, and Megan's in New York and Jake is in New York and I'm here, and so Dr. Doan and Andy kept working on it, and they turned it into a one-man show with a bunch of video and stuff. And so since we've left, it's continuing on this awesome journey of research and changing and becoming something different. And so it's a really cool multimedia piece now, and it's just a one-man show, and he's done it back at Dixon Place again and at other venues throughout New York. So it was a really cool opportunity.
So they still go to medical schools and they perform it, or is it?
I don't
mostly
know
just
if he's
a
still
regular
going
play now?
to. I don't know if he's still going to medical schools. I think that there's still a relationship with Hershey Medical, but I haven't talked to him about it recently. But I know that it's still in progress, because he's also working on a piece about anxiety, because he openly suffers with anxiety and depression, and so he's just constantly using theater as a way not only to educate other people, but also to cope with the hardships. Like, one of the most amazing things about drifting was that we were performing things as he had just come from the bedside of his sister, right? And so he was struggling through this as we were, and he would write it and then he'd come and have us perform it. Mm-hmm. And it was just, I mean, I had to play him, right? And so it was really, really intimidating, but really a special experience for me to be there embodying something and helping him in a lot of ways work through this extremely difficult situation. And so it's interesting, because this type of application of theater is something that people don't think about very often, right? That we think, oh, theater is just, go sing and dance, make me happy or make me sad and blah, blah, blah. But there are so many far-reaching implications of what theater can do, especially when it comes to like therapeutic things and not only teaching other people, but also as a tool for your own healing and coping with things that science hasn't gotten it down how to deal with anxiety and depression yet. Like they try really hard and they have a lot of things that are working, but I struggle with anxiety and depression, and it's this battle that it's so different than anything a lot of people have ever had to deal with, because there's that stipulation of like, oh, you're depressed, just be happy. Mm-hmm. Right? And that's the worst thing to say to somebody with depression, because they're like, I would if I could, right? And so he's dealing with those very personal things and putting it on stage, and it not only helps him organize this kind of sometimes chaotic existence, and it also teaches us and helps us kind of see a point of view that people not suffering with anxiety or depression couldn't, that they can't understand it. That it's a hard thing to understand, that someone's always sad and always worried about something that is out of their control. And so that's a big reason why I'm just super grateful that I got to be a part of that. And I'm still really close with Dr. Doan and Andrew Belser and all those people that they're, yeah, it's amazing how close you get when you're dealing with that. But his sister passed away during the, as we were writing it, like as we were in rehearsals, that he got a call that she had passed. And it was just really I don't think that I will ever have an experience creating theater that was that visceral. And so, yeah.
So trying to embody his character,
Mm-hmm.
how did you get into his brain? Or, I mean, especially when it's going on, like it's not something that's past. How did you get to know him enough to portray him on stage?
Yeah, so we would spend a lot of time, like after school, like after our really heavy MFA workload, mm-hmm. that we'd be working, doing all of our course load, and then we'd go afterwards whenever we had like a spare hour or two, maybe 3 or 4 hours some days. And we would sit in this room called the ADRI. It's a Arts and Research Design Incubator, and it's this space created specifically for this type of performative research. Mm-hmm. And so we would be there, all of us together, and it was amazing, because when we would go into that room, like when we were in the theater building, it was Dr. Doan, we always called him Andy, but he was, his role was different. And then when we were in the ADRI, it was like all of us were collaborators, were co-collaborators. And so these men that I aspired to, that they became my colleagues. And it was amazing. So I got to know Dr. Doan in a different light, because mm-hmm. the formalities that existed outside didn't exist in that room. That it was, I would ask him questions. I'd be like, so how was that? What was that? What was going on? And he was extremely open with what was going on, which I think was the most, like, I can't imagine like doing that and being as open and as gracious as he was. And so we did, there was that stuff. And then there was the regular character analysis things. Like I had a script and I would look through it and every actor has to take their own interpretation on someone, right? Because when you're playing a character, you are the character. That there's no longer this weird separation. Like I'm not really pretending to be someone else. I'm being me under imaginary circumstances, right? And so, but as far as some of his mannerisms, I would just observe that he always had this thing where he'd like cross his arms and he'd just kind of like shift his weight from one to the other, right? And I just tried to watch him in just his everyday and try to, practice walking like him and things like that. And so I'm also a very physical and movement oriented actor. And so a lot of what I do, I find a lot of use in just making shapes with my body and using movement exercises as a way to understand a character more. But at the end of the day, it's just empathy.
Yeah.
It's just finding a way to have that type of empathy for somebody that isn't you. And try to understand the best you can is what they're going through. Yeah.
That's so cool.
Yeah, it was awesome.
So is this, you said devised work. Is that, can you define that?
Yeah, so devised work is, I've been looking up because it's kind of a new-ish. I mean, it's been around for a while, but it's becoming a phrase that a lot of theatrical practitioners use on the daily. It's like, oh yeah, this devised theater piece that we did. Basically what it means is it's when the ensemble, the director, the writer, and all the technical people, that all of them are involved in creating a story for the very first time.
Okay.
Right? And so then the question becomes, well, is there still a writer? Are they still, in control of the story and stuff like who's number one and who's this kind of. And so drifting, though it had some devised elements to it, it's not necessarily, some people would say that it's not pure devised theater because Dr. Doan was the playwright and Andy was the director. And then, but we had a sound, but both of them were heavily influenced by what we were doing on stage. And so if we did something different or if we had a thought, it was open and we'd share it and then they'd like delete something or write something in, right? And so it's similar to the project that's going on, not 100%, but it's a more liberal version of what we're doing right now with Solana. That the play that we're doing here on campus it's a workshop. And so they had a meeting with the whole cast and they just asked the cast, okay, what's your story? Right. And then as we did the read through last night, some of those stories were showing up in the in the play. And so it's just another way to gather information and creating. And so really cool. One of the devised pieces that was actually a little more purely devised work was with this intensive with some people that are connected to the Steppenwolf Theater in Chicago, which is kind of at the forefront of all of this kind of stuff, right? And so they were there and they brought this, this short story, and we all got together and we figured it out, right, as an ensemble. So there was, I think, 16? Yeah, I think 12 to 16 of us actors. And there were directors and movement people, and we all just got together and we tried to figure out, okay, how are we going to tell this story? Because it's not a play, it's a short story, right? And so we got the short story, and then we're like, well, we need this character, so who wants to do this? And oh, you'd be great at this. And what if we had? And so you just figure it out together as a group, and it's really fun because the thing I like about devised work is that the ensemble takes center stage. Right, that there's still leads, right? There's still the main character and all of these different characters, but as an ensemble who created the piece, you invest more of yourself into it because those ideas were your ideas, right? And one of the big things that I wish anybody auditioning for any type of theater or acting or anything, that they would just get out of their heads that the lead role is the most important role. And that the most talented person goes to the lead. If you've watched The Greatest Showman recently, that is a perfect example of what happens when the ensemble steps up their game.
Yeah.
Right? That the
awesome show.
without the ensemble,
Greatest.
right? I'm just saying,
Yeah.
like without the ensemble, that show would not be what it is.
Absolutely.
Like, I mean, I love Hugh Jackman. He is an amazing actor. And, you know, all the other leads in that they're amazing individuals, but it was their cohesiveness and the fact that there were no small roles in that show. None of them were. You know, even the tall guy that didn't really say more than a couple lines, right? That each one of those people, that they have a lasting impression because they realized that they were an important part in that piece, right? And as somebody who's starting to get more on the other side of the table, where I'm seeing things from a director's perspective and casting perspective and, you know, an acting coach perspective, that I start to see how frustrating it can be when like an actor is, you know, a little bit maybe full of themselves and they're like, I can't be in the show because I'm not the lead. And I'm like, you don't understand. This could be awesome with you because you're an amazing actor, but I need you here more than I need you there. Right. And it's just, I always say this, but acting is one of the most selfless positions when you do it well. When you do it well, that it's a service position because it's not about me. It no longer becomes about me. It becomes about the audience's experience and the character who I'm trying to portray, right? And trying to do them justice. And so it really, if you're a good actor, I think the mark of a good actor is one who recognizes that they are a servant to the story and a servant to the audience, rather than someone who's like, oh, look, it's all about me. I'm so wonderful. It's just, that's not it. Missing the point.
Come on.
I feel like you could feel an audience in a room. You know, you could feel the vibe, but how do you anticipate for audiences? How do you plan to create empathy with a character?
So are you asking how do I clarify a little bit?
So, I mean, you're going to have to win over the crowd basically at some point. But I guess, like, what do you do to anticipate that? Like, how do you anticipate to serve the audience?
Oh, so yeah. So what I do is, so when it's about the audience, it's, I guess, let me try to figure out a more accurate and precise way to say this, that when I'm performing, if I'm doing it for myself, instantly I'm cutting off the audience, that the audience is no longer there, right? We talk about the fourth wall in theater. And there's, you know, what the fourth wall means is that, like, right here in this room, there are four walls, right? And there's a lovely somebody watching us from through the window, but these four walls don't exist on a stage, right? On a stage, there's only like three walls, and then there's this invisible wall that the audience is sitting behind, right? And so oftentimes what actors will do is they'll when they're cutting off the audience, they pretend as if they are in this room where nobody else is, right? But you can't actually ever ignore that there is an audience out there. And so the way that you're sensitive to what the audience needs is in the way that you're connected with your scene partner. So if we're having this scene, right, and it's something funny, and there's this laugh, or there's this joke coming up, or there's this funny bit that's supposed to be funny for the audience, blah blah blah, and we do it, and the audience doesn't laugh, we don't just sit there and wait until someone you react to that. You feel what the audience is doing, right? And you can hear how they're reacting. And when they laugh, you have to let them laugh. Oftentimes what will happen is that actors will panic. They'll be doing this thing, they'll do something that they didn't even think was funny because they were having an honest moment and the audience is enjoying it. And then they just keep on talking. And then the audience doesn't have a moment to enjoy it, right? And so it's almost an art into reading the audience and still staying in the moment. That you hear them laughing, and then right at the peak of the laughter, there's this moment where it starts to drop down just a little bit, and that's when you start going again, right? Because there are times, and then, you know, there are other people that oscillate to the opposite direction, that they start stealing focus just to be funny, or they start changing things and doing ridiculous stuff that's not a part of the play just to get a laugh, right? And that's not respecting the audience either, because then what you're doing is you're saying, look at me, this is more important than the story, right? And they didn't come necessarily to see you, unless it's your grandma and mom, right? But aside from them, they didn't come to just see you. They came to see this story and this show. And so the way that you can anticipate that is to just be open and get involved in being connected with the reality of being, right? and the reality of doing. Yeah, that oftentimes when actors are on stage, especially beginning actors, but even professional actors do it, that they just kind of phone it in, that they're not really there. They're not really in the space that they say they're in. They're just kind of going through the motions, or they do something because they think it'll be funny. And sometimes it is, like sometimes people kind of give a courtesy laugh and then it's over. But the really, really hilarious ones are the ones where people are 100% serious about what they're doing, right? And so the way that you connect with the audience like that is that you recognize that they're there. You don't ignore their existence, right? That you start to feel their energy and you feel, okay, are they with me? Are they not with me? You know, and so it's something that I think some actors, that they're just obnoxious and can do it right away. But most actors, I think it just takes practice, or as one of my teachers, Richard Robichaud, said, that it just takes hours in the cockpit. You just have to be in there and you just have to do it. So
Interesting. So going back to devised work a little bit,
Yeah.
how is devised work different than traditional writing, and then how does that affect the characters in the story?
Yeah, like, is it harder for playwrights to just sit down and just write something out and then work with the actors to kind of create them into the story? Or is it more like devised work is easier because it's more free-flowing?
So I think that most of the writers that I know that, like there's this one play we did, ID, the playwright's name is Sangu Jakam, and he was a writer with the Emerging Writers Group at the Public Theater, which a lot of people, you know, out here haven't really heard of, but the Public Theater in New York is kind of a big deal. And so he was writing with them, and Penn State was able to contract him to write a play for us. And so he came, and the way that he wrote is he came with kind of an idea of what he had wanted to write, but he was going to base it off of what we had together. And so that's another one similar to Dr. Doan's play, where it was that he had an idea and then he came and had an ensemble of actors, and we did different exercises and talked about things and talked about the construct of race and racism in America, because he was pretty sure that that's most of his work is surrounding that and trying to, you know, solve that problem of racism and the construct of it, not necessarily like the individual problems, but this big construct of it. And so we were trying to tackle that, which is kind of a big feat. But so for him, it was a really, really great gift to have us there, because he was basing his characters off of things that he saw us do. And so I think that it depends on the playwright. It depends on what kind of writer they are. But I think that most of the playwrights that I know, that they would just, you know, they would die to have an ensemble of people to just, you know, use and say, all right, I have this story, start doing something, and let's play these games, let's roll with it, and let's just do some improv exercises and try to figure out, you know, what is here, right? Because then you have somebody and you have something in front of you. I guess the pitfall is that when you have just a specific group of people, then your creativity to a lesser playwright, it could be kind of stunted. But you know, your creativity and your imagination is your tool, I think, as a playwright ultimately. And so, but I think playwrights generally, they can get their inspiration from anywhere. I've dabbled with trying to write my own stuff, and so for me, I take it from characters that I know, people that I know, and base it and shift it and things like that to try to have a bit of humanity in it. But yeah, so that's so the big difference though between I guess devised work and more traditional theater is that in traditional theater, you're just kind of you're a servant to the text a little bit more, in a different, your relationship to the text is different, because that's where most of the time you don't ever get the playwright. And so you and the director have to figure out together, okay, what is this about? What is this character going through? How are we going to tell this story? Versus devised work, where if it's purely devised work, you have a whole group of people that are creating this together and you do it for the first time, right? And so it's like you're in the room with the playwright because all of you are the playwright. And so I've been really lucky because I've worked with, you know, quite a few playwrights now. And that doesn't happen very often for a lot of actors. It's very rare that you get to be in the room with the writer and then you get to perform the writer's work while they're there. That doesn't happen very often. And so it's a really cool opportunity to see that, because you just get a different relationship and you get a different insight. And like this, the script analysis is just different when the playwright's there, because they're the ones who wrote it. And you can say, well, what was your intention with this, and blah, blah, blah. And they're like, well, I don't really know. What do you think? And then you can tell them, and they're like, yeah, that's great. I think that's close to what I was hoping. So that's the big difference, is that devised work is much more hands-on. I really enjoy devised work, but the thing that's hard about devised work is coming up with a story that matters. Mm-hmm. That the playwrights and the traditional plays, it's kind of like the difference between reading someone's blog and reading an article. They might say the exact same thing, but like a published article, that had to go through a group of people that say, oh yeah, this is valid, this is an important thing to say because of this. Here we're going to put our JSTOR stamp of approval on it and send it to you, right?
Okay.
And then someone's blog is just like, oh, Auntie Frederica wrote this blog and I'm going to go read it now. And it might be extremely valid and extremely poignant. Yeah. Right, and worthy to be published, but she just didn't go through the steps, right? And so, but then there's also other blogs that you're just like, this was a waste of my time. And so, yeah.
Yeah, but still fun.
Yeah, but still fun, right? And so it's so that's the big difference. It's the difference between, I think, published work and non-published work. Now, devised works can become published, but it's just a different way of creating the theater.
I was going to ask, is it like a tendency of devised work to stay smaller production usually? Or like, would I know any devised works that have, I don't know, gotten rewritten and then become a bigger musical?
I am not a scholar of all the devised works that are out there right now. I think that for the most of the big name musicals, like the ones on Broadway and stuff like that, have a writing team attached to them, because it's not like I said, we're kind of at the grassroots of this new devised work has been around forever. Like I think probably since like the 50s and 60s, like more the 60s, 70s is when it starting to become a popular art form. But now it's becoming something that's even more viable, right? And so there are a lot of theatrical productions that I think are probably off Broadway. I even hesitate to say that, though, because there might be some on Broadway that I just haven't heard of yet, because my life is kind of education town and working on my and so there's a lot on my plate. But like another thing about Broadway is that the producers, they need kind of a sure bet, right? Because it costs a lot of money to produce something, especially in Times Square in New York City, or in the city at all. Yeah. It's expensive. And so they're not going to produce something that a bunch of people are like, yeah, this is something cool, that it has to be proven before it gets there. That's why, like something like, Lin-Manuel Miranda, that he already has In the Heights, and now he has Hamilton. And so, but he got Hamilton to be so massive. I mean, he'd been working on that forever, and I'm sure that people were helping him, right? That he wrote it, but then there's, I'm sure he'd be the first person to say, yeah, I couldn't have done this without, so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so. And if you notice that, if you look at the cast of In the Heights and in the cast of in Hamilton, that a lot of the actors are the same, because he likes to work with the same people. And so that's why this word devised work is such a weird, ethereal thing right now. It's really hard to define, because isn't anything devised? It's like the word devised means to create something. Right. And so it's like, well, if you sit down and you write something, it's like, well, yeah, that's a devised piece that you devised as you were sitting in your bedroom typing on your bed. I'm devising this as you go, right? I'm devising a plan, right? And so it's but as far as the ensemble, that the ensemble's role in a musical is pretty vital, I think, especially during the workshop stages. Like if you were to ask, Mike Heitzman and Eileen Reed that are here right now, that they would say that it's just invaluable, the stuff that they've learned from the different workshops that they've been able to do throughout the country as they're trying to prepare this to make a New York debut one day. That's the ultimate goal for them. And so playwrights are, most playwrights, I think, are pretty humble people, that they're not really, some I'm sure are pretty arrogant, but I think for the most part, the playwrights that I've met that they're very respectful and they're very they love the human experience. Otherwise, they wouldn't be writing about it. So, did that answer your question?
I don't even remember where it came from, but
You
it was
know?
interesting.
It was a
The
good
difference
thought.
between devised
Thought
and
train.
theatrical,
Oh, yeah.
I think we
Yeah.
got there.
I think it was a good train thought. I was on it. But
Yeah.
we also wanted to ask you about your South Africa play.
Yeah.
Did you go specifically to make the play to South Africa?
So it was this play ID with Sanguja Kam from the
Oh,
public.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
what we did is that play we got together and we all took a DNA test.
Oh.
And so because the way that he wanted to tackle racism through this play was,
Okay.
what are you really? Like,
Yeah.
like we all have these ideas is, oh yeah, I'm European, I'm white, I'm totally, white power,
Yeah.
blah, 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 all that
Yeah.
stuff. And then to find out that this guy who is, extremely racist, this white privileged, cop that I played, that he was like 30% African.
Wow.
Right. And because that happens, that
Right.
there's, all kinds of stuff. One of the actresses, my dear friend, LJ Stewart, she's just a storm of an actress, just changing the world right now. She's amazing. But she's very fair skinned, from Alabama, blue eyes, gorgeous African-American woman. And I'll never forget when she got, I hope she hears, if she hears this, I'm sorry, Elle, if I'm being too personal about your life, but she, it was just so visceral for me because she and many other African Americans can't do their ancestry farther back than, the 1800s when their family was illegally brought here from Africa. Right. And, well, I guess legally at that point, but awfully brought here. But, she had no idea. And so she had always been told growing up in Southern Alabama that you're white, you're not black, you're white. Right. Because her skin was so fair and her eyes were blue. And so she shared with me some points about how she had a trouble fitting in sometimes because she didn't know what group she belonged in. Now, she's an extremely powerful woman, but when she got her DNA test, it was 80% African.
Wow.
Like 89 or something like that, like extremely high, and from a specific tribe in Cameroon.
Wow.
And so to have that gift given to her was just something that, I don't know, I'll never forget that. And, to see the other African Americans in the group too, their reaction, both, one of my friends, he didn't get the answer that he was looking for. And he's from Flint, Michigan. And he also, his mom was white and his dad was African American, and he just didn't know. I mean, he knew his mom's side, but he never really got much of his dad's side till much later. And so this process was really hard for him because it came back like 80% European, which is not what he necessarily wanted to hear. Because he knew that part. And so it's not that he hated that part of that's not it.
Right.
But he wanted to know he wanted to know the African part. Where does that come from? And so I was like that DNA test said that I was 16% from Indian subcontinent, so from India. And I was like, whoa, what? I'm Mormon. I know all of my ancestry. Where did that? And so that was just such a huge shock for me.
Yeah.
And so we did that, and each one of us had some kind of surprise in our DNA. Either it was more European than we thought, or more African than we thought, or I didn't even know African was in there, kind of thing. And so we did this play involving all these different people, and it was a hip hop play, and so there was a lot of rapping involved, and and that type of that genre, which I think is just powerful and extremely effective for today's stories. And so we did it, and we'd workshopped it, and we rehearsed it, and then we took it to a festival in Grahamstown, South Africa. And so where apartheid is still a very fresh wound, I think, for some people. But the thing that was amazing about doing that play about the construct of racism in America in a place where they, I think, have dealt with the issue of race and racism, and very fresh in their history, they've dealt with it with so much grace that it's just amazing. This is another memory I'll never forget from that. But we were outside of one of the performances, and one of the ushers, he's this older gentleman in Africa, and he was sitting there and he was talking to me, and I was just asking him, like, so how do you do it? You know, as a Black African, how do you deal with, you know, like seeing people like me or seeing other people like white people that, you know, because he was old enough to have been like he was probably in his 60s. And so most of his life was spent when there was all these awful things happening because of apartheid. And he said, I realized that I can't hate my brother. And I was like, what? That's amazing. Because he was just like, it's pointless. It's done. It's over. Nothing that I do or don't do is going to stop the terrors that have happened from happening. They've already happened. So the only thing that I can do, the only option for me, is to love the person and to change and to move on. And every single person that I met there, that was the case. And so it was incredible to go down there and perform that play and, you know, see the culture and work on it some more. And then when we came back, we did a few more performances around Pennsylvania, and yeah, it was just a phenomenal experience. And so, yeah, that was the South Africa play.
Oh, okay.
We took it down there for that purpose, to show them. And it was really well received. That everybody there was like, this is really cool. I had no idea that this was going on.
Yeah.
And so,
what was the reception like versus like the South Africa versus Pennsylvania? Like,
oh,
how did
man.
people
South
view
Africa
it differently?
Loved it. Pennsylvania, it was like controversy town.
Really?
Like there's a point in the play at the end where, like, my character was undercover Michael, and he was this white, you know, vehemently racist cop, right? And so, you know, I had my own backstory for why he was that way, but he was just this almost irredeemable human being, and that was the point. Because at the very end of the play, he gets his DNA test done, or his wife steals his DNA. Like, it's a really comedic thing that he's sleeping and she comes up with a swab and like takes some cells from it, like takes it and sends it off to DNA because she's sick of him being, you know, this inappropriate, awful person. And she's like, I'm going to change you. And so she gets the DNA test, and it turns out that he's 80% African. Not 80%. Like that's ridiculous. It was like 30 something, like 28% African.
But still, like, substantial.
Still a substantial amount of Africa, right? And so it just rocks this guy to his core, because he's been awful to these people, and he's like, what does this mean now? And so he goes and he grabs his gun and he points it and holds up these two black kids, and is like at gunpoint, like telling them, look, I don't know what this is. I've never used the N-word. I don't run around, you know, I don't wear a swastika. I don't do this. So I don't understand. What does this mean? If I'm black, blah, 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 blah. And he says, I don't know. Should I just kill myself? Right. And so, he pulls the gun on himself and is about to do it. And then the frame stops, and then we rewind and we kind of do a replay on a different option. And the black kid, played by one of my dear friends, Cecil Bletcher, he comes up as I have him at gunpoint, and he puts his head against the gun, and he just says, I see you. I see you. And it just, this guy crumbles and falls. And so that was, the one night, I'll never forget this night. It was a very raucous night that night, but we were there. And I had him at gunpoint, and I was asking him the question, what should I do? What should I do? Someone from the audience, before they even knew that I was going to pull the gun on myself, yelled, kill yourself, blank, blankety blank.
Wow.
And so that night I decided to give it to him. And so I looked out at the audience, because normally I just look at him and I cock my gun and I put it to my head. But that night I looked out at them, and I cocked the gun, I put it to my head.
Oh my God.
And they stopped it, and we went and finished the play how it was supposed to be. And afterwards, I got in my regular clothes and I went out to the lobby, and there was this group of black African American people sitting there, and they were terrified of me.
Really?
Like, I went to just shake their hand and be like, hey, how's it going? They would not make eye contact with me. It was really interesting. And then there were some of my white friends that had a really hard time with it, because there was limited amount of time in this play to tell everybody's story. And so we were focusing on, you know, we were focusing on this kind of from a African American perspective, but also there were lots of elements of truth from what actually is happening in America. And so there were some white people that didn't sit well with, because they didn't want to believe that, you know, that there were racist white cops in the world.
Right.
And they felt a little attacked by it. But I think that type of theater, that it's good to be challenged sometimes, right?
Right.
It's good to do that because you start to really question things that you wouldn't normally question. And in that questioning, you can really start to discover a deeper understanding of the human condition. Yeah. And again, I think that that's the most important thing about theater, right? Is that theater is, and acting classes and that kind of stuff, that there's no other class offered that will allow you to empathize and practice empathizing with people who are completely different than you. And I think that that's the value of theater, is that you start either as an audience member or as a participant, that you have an opportunity to empathize with someone other than yourself. And you start to see things from a different point of view, and you can become more mindful, a more mindful human being and contributor to your society. And so I think that that's the most, but yeah, so that's that play, South Africa, was pretty awesome.
Why do you think it was so different between the two countries, I guess? Because, like, what, I don't know, cultural aspects, like what about the country's legacy, like,
so
affected
I think that in America, and this is again my opinion, right?
Yeah.
My
Just from what you
research
saw.
and from what I saw, and from my you know, little amount of research around this, and trying to understand all points of view, that in America, it feels like, at least as a white male in this culture, that it feels like a lot of white people, or Euro-American people, European people, that we kind of felt and were told that racism died with Martin Luther King Jr., right? That he solved the problem of racism with his speech, right? And that since then, we don't, you know, all kinds of, you know, things have been said, all while my friends in South, you know, in the South American, like not South America, but like South United States, the Southern United States, that they're still getting, you know, shot because they're black, not for really any other reason than a white police officer is afraid of them because they've taken this, you know, too far, and they're afraid of them, or, you know, they have legitimate reasons as to why they don't trust black people or things like that. But I even remember from a young age my grandpa telling me to never trust a Mexican because his grandfather was stabbed in the back by one time. Yes. Right? And I'm like, well, okay, but most of my friends are Hispanic, so Dad and Grandpa, I'm 10, right? And so, but that type of stuff but yet I then turned around and was like, oh yeah, racism doesn't exist in our country anymore. Racists aren't real. They're this small little group of like Nazis somewhere, but they hide themselves, right? Yeah. And then, but then today, it's like we still see, like, especially under, you know, the recent administration and the controversy that's caused, there's a lot of, you know, people, swastika wearing Nazis running around, like vehemently saying that they are the master race in America, and they're kind of going untouched. And so in a country where racism doesn't exist, that shouldn't be here, right? And so it's really hard because these words like white privilege are tossed around now, and white people, especially people that come from impoverished backgrounds like myself, that's a hard thing for us to understand, because the word white privilege means that I somehow, because I'm white, life is easier for me, right? And though that's true, that it's not necessarily financially true, right? That it doesn't have to be financially true, but that what it does mean is that I will never, ever, as a white person, ever experience being afraid of being shot by a police officer. I'll never have to deal with that. I will likely never, ever be looked at the mall and be followed around and be asked if I had stolen something, which I know my friends have. It also means that I will always get a cab in New York City. We did this one time, that me and a couple of my friends, that we were in New York, and they were black, I'm white. And they're like, Aaron, grab us a cab. And I'm like, what? Why don't you grab a cab? And he's like, they'll never stop for me. I'm like, whatever. They will too. And so like, right, watch. He stood out there. 4 or 5 cabs passed. I stepped out there. Didn't even get to raise my hand. A cab stopped. The first one that came by. Another time we were in New York, we were just walking across the street and like we were waiting for a crosswalk, right? And we were all standing there, and my two, one of my friends he's Hispanic from Texas, and the other one is black from Chicago, and they're standing in front of me, and this cab pulls over, and he's like, "You guys need a ride?" And they looked at each other, and they're like, "What? No, we're good. We're just going across the street." And he's like, "Okay," and he left, and they're like, "Wait, why did that?" Oh, Aaron's with us. He had stopped for me because they had never had a cab stop for them like that. Just pull over and solicit their patronage, right?
Wow.
And so that's something I will never have to experience that. You know, amongst a myriad of other things, right? I will never, ever have to experience those things that I know my Black American friends have. And that's the privilege we're talking about. It's nothing more than that. And so when white people say things like, "Oh, I'm not privileged, blah, blah, blah," or "white privilege isn't a thing," that it's kind of a slap in the face, or it's poking this 400-year-old wound that still is around from slavery, because slavery, like racism never stopped. We just stopped looking at it when Martin Luther King Jr. died, right? We just, and when I mean we, and like the white people, that we stopped. And I really don't like that phrase, white people. For me, I'm European American. If we have to say African American, then I should be European American. But that's just my own preference, not putting on anybody else. But I think that the reason that it was received differently in both countries was because in South Africa, I think that that Nelson Mandela, you know, with peace and reconciliation, that he did something different than we have, that we haven't had a leader in that position. I mean, it was wonderful to have President Obama in, because it's starting to show, we're starting to be a little more open-minded with the way that we vote. But he had a different job, right? That he wasn't elected from like President Mandela. I mean, he got out of prison, where he had been in prison for being black. You know, and then he was the leader of the country, and he had just as many things and varying things to deal with, but he chose for his platform, and the first thing to talk about is peace and reconciliation. That there is no way that the white people, that the Africans can actually change what's happened. Nothing is going to give me back the years that I spent on Robben Island, right? But we can move forward, and we have to move forward. And so I think in America, we haven't heard that yet, right? It's been said, but we haven't heard it yet as a people, because it's still it's been a festering wound, I think, for 400 years. And for us on the privileged end of it, that we've never had to deal with the things, right? But the African Americans in this country have, and they've been dealing with it. And so to say that it doesn't exist it's really hard for them to hear and accept, because, and it is. I mean, I've been blind to it, for the majority of my life until I did this play. Another plug for plays and acting and theater, right? That I seriously, I don't know that I would have had my eyes opened to this and understood it had I not taken the chance to really get to know people. And so I think that people in America, especially white people, but also people on both sides of this issue, that there's a lot of harsh feelings and a lot of harsh things have been said and done, and it's really hard. And so we've got to tough up, we've got to sit down, and we've got to be able to see each other, for everything that they are as individuals. That, and this is probably, I feel like I'm rambling, but
No, it's fine.
this is, so one of the big things that happened to me in grad school was I was talking with one of my friends, Cecil, and he's a kid from Chicago, and we were doing this exercise, and it came out in the exercise that he said, "You make me uncomfortable because you're white." And I was like, "What?" what do you mean? I'm one of the nicest guys in the world. How can I make you uncomfortable? And so afterwards we were walking, I know I'm like not, and I mean, I had hair then. And so I was even less intimidating than I am now, where I shaved my head. And so we were walking to the bus just to go back to our cars and drive home. And I was like, Cecil, please don't take this the wrong way, but I want to know what it's been like for you, Cecil Blutcher, as a black man in America. I don't want you to speak for all of the black people or everybody with with more pigment in their skin than I have, but what has been your experience in America? And he stopped and he looked at me and he was like, he just started laughing. He's like, Aaron, you are the first white person to ever ask me that question. And he's in his 20s, right? And he just said, thank you for asking me. And so he told me what his experience was. And since then, like people that I don't, it's not just I go up to random people and ask, but like the head of my MFA program is an African American from the South, and he told me how he never got, like, he has a hard time catching cabs in New York, and I asked him, what's it been like for you, Steve, as an African American in America? And he said the same thing. He's 40, and he was like, no one's ever asked me that. No white person has ever asked me that question. And that's the problem, right? And I was open with all of them too. I'm like, feel free to not answer, right? If you don't feel comfortable, please don't. I want to know what your experience has been, because I'm tired of making assumptions, right? Which most of the time are wrong. Sometimes they're right, depending on the individual, but we need to start seeing people as people. It takes more work, right? And you're never going to get rid of your prejudices and judgments. You're never going to. Right? Like, you're going to see somebody and you're going to make a rash judgment. You're going to make a prejudice towards that person. What you have to do is you have to see beyond that. You have to see the person as what they are, all of what they are, right? Their skin color, their origin, their family history, what they identify as, all of these things, just to get to know the person, right? You have to know those things about them. The only way to do that is to get to know individuals and to get to the place where you can see people as individuals, not as a group of white people or black people or Asian people or whatever. That you have to get to a place where you see them as an individual person made up of all of their history and all of their heritage, no matter what it is, right? Like, for anybody to play me, they have to know that I walk around feeling like the inside of me is part Samoan. They should know that about me, because I grew up with a bunch of Samoans in Washington, and I always gravitate, whenever I go to the PCC, I always gravitate to the Samoan village, because that's where I feel at home, right? They need to know that about me, but they would never know that about me just by looking at me, right? And so I think that, to answer your question, why it was received differently, I think that that's why. I think that in America, we are still struggling. We're in the thick of it. And I really hope that the current administration and all the things that are happening, that we don't let that distract us from continuing to struggle with this, because we can't just forget it. We can't. Too many, young men and women have died and been abused because of our inability to see each other, And another soapbox I could get on is about women. It's the same thing, right? Like, Jackson and I will never, ever have to be afraid of walking in the dark by ourselves at night. We will never have to worry about that. We will never have to question whether or not we got a job because of our gender. We will never have to question if that person looked at us funny because they had something up their sleeve, or they were objectifying me because of the clothes I was wearing. We will never have to deal with that, ever. And that's male privilege, right? That's the privilege of being a man in this country and in this world, frankly. And so those types of things are things that will only get solved when we start to see each other and empathize with one another on an individual basis, which is harder and more time consuming. But I'd rather do that than see more people die unjustly and abused unjustly, right? So
like, all these ideas, you feel like that was kind of the point of making the play, the ID play. It's like, it's a way of portraying, like, a way that we can have peace and reconciliation.
Yeah, I think that it was trying really hard. And again, we only worked on it for, like, I think in earnest in its final iteration, we only worked on it for like a year. And then we all graduated and left, and the project kind of just exists now until Sangu decides to do something else with it. And so what we were trying to do is we're trying to articulate, well, what can we do? Like, what is something that I personally, Aaron Densley, can do to solve this problem? Because it feels too big, right? Because there are African Americans that are getting shot for no reason. And there are, white people that are good white people that are getting not discriminated against, but that they have these heavy prejudices towards and are being hated because they're white, but they're wonderful people. And so there's just so much hate and divisiveness happening in this country that's supposed to be for everybody, that's supposed to be united, right? And so what do we do? And so we were looking at this, and Sangu does a lot of stuff around DNA. And so we decided to take our DNA tests, and we're like, you know what? There's something in that. I'm not offering that as the only solution, because you have to take the next step, right? You can't just passively sit back. You've got to do something about it. But I think that it's a great place to start. And so I think that that was the point of writing. It was just a bunch of writers, just a bunch of artists trying to figure out this conversation. And I don't think we did it perfectly, right? And there was a lot in our company. It was not easy. That show was not an easy one to create. There were people that had really hurt feelings because of it. And some people ended up leaving the program over it. And it was hard. It was a hard thing, and it's not, the person who left, it wasn't all his fault. It wasn't all his fault, and it wasn't all the other parts' fault. It was just it was a mess. It was just a mess. It was a mess of impossible situations. And I think that when we talk about, male privilege and white privilege and all these inequalities between gender and race and personal identity and things like that it's just, it just feels like a big mess. And so none of us wanted that. And so I think that's why Sangu decided to write it. And I think that's why he continues to, because he's trying to find a way to offer some kind of solution for it. And so that's what we came up with. So I think it's a good place to start, but I don't think it's certainly not the only solution.
So basically, like, theater is a way of dealing with huge issues, but in micro, like in small scale.
Yeah, I think so. I think that all of us that were affected by it, it's like the ripple effect, right? That, you make one tiny little drop and it'll affect the whole water if you let it. And, as long as you don't put up dams. And so, but I think that that's the power that theater and media can have, right? If we allow it to. Right. I think that there's the issue of making money, right? And that's celebritydom, that's a completely different beast, right? That I often get when I tell people I'm an actor, they're like, "Oh, so what have you been in?" I'm like, "I am the only professional that you would ever ask that to." And they're like, "Well, what do you mean?" I'm like, "Do you ask your dentist? So are you President Obama's dentist, or are you just like a regular community dentist, right? Or wait, before you operate on me, emergency technician, are you like a celebrity technician? Like, have you worked on anybody that I know before you saved my life?" Right? I am the only one. Actors are the only ones, but yet they're like, "So what have you been in? Have you been anything I know?" I'm like, "No, but I've done a lot of work." And they're like, "Oh, okay. So you're just like a community actor. So what do you really do?" I'm like, "I really am an actor. Like, that's really what I do. I go out on an audition." And they're like, "Well, how do you?" And before I was a professional actor, they're like, "So you're getting your degree in theater. So what are you going to do with that?" I'm like, "I'm going to act and I'm going to get paid to do it." And it's hard. It's hard because people see what people outside of theater see is they see, these celebrities and all these people with tons of money. And they're like, "Well, don't you want to make millions of dollars?" I'm like, "No, I want to make enough money to put a roof over my family's head and feed them." That's kind of it. Because everything else they can do on their own. And that is a much more doable thing. Being a celebrity is up to New York and LA. And so the theater that I'm interested in and what my business is trying to affect change for the positive through art and through my medium of art, which is portraying life under imaginary circumstances, and teaching people to have empathy, right? Both through my performances and through my teaching here at the school, right? That there's just so much empathy that you can learn from this art form. And I think that that's what this world needs more of. And so that's how I'm choosing to make my little footprint on my time here on Earth. Because I think that that's important. I think it's important that we do stuff more than just for ourselves. And I think artists are kind of, I mean, I'm biased because I am one, but I think we artists have a really good grasp on sacrificing monetary gains for something we feel passionately about. And I think that that's a good thing. I think it's a good thing. Because I'm not a leech on society, like some people think. You know, as actors, that it's kind of a, oh, you're an actor. Okay, so you wait tables for a living. I've never waited a table in my life. Actually, the only time I ever waited tables, the only time I waited tables was when I was a student here at PCC, at the Hale Aloha. Yes. That's the only time I've waited tables. As an actor, nope, never waited tables. I've been a janitor, but I've never waited tables. So,
nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
What else you guys got for me?
Well, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, anything
It's
more?
been nice talking.
No, thanks for having me. I just, just reiterate that acting is important, right? I mean, it's hard to see how it's important unless you do it. That it's one of the big, like, especially classes on this university, but not just this one, every university has a hard time understanding, well, why is acting important? Don't you guys just entertain people and do funny exercises? And I'm like, well, if you want to interview for a job one day, then you need an acting class, because what I'm doing is I'm teaching you how to present yourself in a real, honest way. That actors aren't liars. We're really good at telling someone else's truth. Like, that's what we do as an actor. That's what I do as an actor, right? I'm living under imaginary circumstances. But from the technique of acting, where vocal production, stage presence, all of those things, I'm like, you really don't see how that's important for people who want to get a job one day? Because I interview for a living. Like, I'm an actor for a living, but every job that I get, I have to interview for. And so when I was on Hawaii 5-0, I had to go into a room, I had to think about what I was wearing, I had to present myself and convince that person that I was worth their money, right? And I did it, and I knocked it out of the park. I got a gig as a bad guy. It was fun. It was fun. But I got a job because of the training that I've had as an actor.
Right.
And that, whether or not you're going to be a professional actor one day, I think any business student would, especially marketing students, or anybody who is interested in, being a competitive force in the workforce, needs to know how to read other people's behavior and how to portray themselves in a way that they deem appropriate, right? And that's an acting class, right? Because that's what we do in acting classes, is we teach you how to read behavior and how to be honest and truthful in the moment and how to relate with somebody different than yourself. And that's just something that I think is vital for any university that's trying to prepare young people for a future, no matter what it's in. So that's, I guess I've spoken.
And
cut.
And cut.
No, but
Great
that's what
job,
I've got.
Everybody.
Great. Thank you.
Well, it's been awesome talking with you.
Yes,
Thanks for coming
thank you
on.
guys. You're awesome.
Using your time, coming to talk to us.
Yep.
Cool.
Anytime.
Thanks for tuning in. This was the Xeno Podcast. You can follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Xeno Podcast.
That's Xeno Podcast. If you have any questions or comments about what we talked about today, or suggestions for future episodes, you can email us at podcastzeno@gmail.com.
This podcast was brought to you by BYU-Hawaii's Reading and Writing Center. Thanks for learning by listening.